Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. I'm Brandon, and I'm here to share things that interest me and things that I think the Lord has brought to my attention. This is episode number 132, and today I'm very pleased to bring you another interview with my good friend Bethany Alvey, who is a spiritual director. I spent the last year or so going through a program with her as she was developing her spiritual direction practice. I found it very helpful and also very informative. Now, until that process, I knew very little about spiritual direction, but it's something I hear about quite a bit now, especially as I spend most of my time outside of evangelical and institutional church circles. So I thought maybe it would be useful to you, if you aren't already familiar with it, to understand what spiritual direction's all about and what you might expect if you had a spiritual director. So enjoy this interview with Bethany and I. Well, hi, good evening. It's nice to talk to you again.
So happy to be back, Brandon.
We spoke a couple months back and we had a fun interview, and then I went through you for about a year with the spiritual direction warm-up that you were doing. And so I thought this would be an interesting topic to return to and actually interview you about, since now we've actually been through that experience together. But at the same time, even though we did that together, I saw it from my perspective, not from yours, and I'm not quite sure where you're going with it in your mind. So I would love to hear about it from the perspective of the spiritual director, not from my own, directee position.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to start by talking about the difference between religion and spirituality, because, we spend a lot of time in the church world thinking about religion and not so much about spirituality, kind of, I think, because we evangelicals tend to think of spirituality as a watered down form of church. So why don't you give me your general thoughts about what's the difference between religion and spirituality, and where this fits into spiritual direction?
Absolutely. I love this question. First, I don't think that spirituality and religion are mutually exclusive, that they can both exist together and in different mixes in every person. Some person is going to be really heavily weighted towards spirituality. Another person might be really heavily weighted toward religion. But when I'm talking, or for me, when I'm talking about the different modalities of spirituality and religion, that spirituality is the receptivity in ourselves to something that is greater.
Okay. As opposed to the practice, which is religion.
And then religion is the practice of it. And it can be practiced in lots of different ways. It can be physical practice of our ideas. It can be mental scaffolding and theological dogma for what we believe it to be true about the divine and that which is greater. But you don't necessarily need to have one without the other, and both can exist at the same time in different measures.
Okay. So based on that foundation, then how would you define spiritual direction?
Yeah, I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about this too, because you're going to have lots of different names for this same practice. And it's actually a discourse in spiritual direction circles. There's been lots of conversations around, is this the appropriate term for what it is that we are doing? And nobody's really come to an agreement as to whether or not this is the appropriate terminology for it. So other words are a spiritual companion. I love the traditional Irish phrase anam cara, soul friend, which my website and business is the Scottish Gaelic form of that, cottage anam, and it means soul friend. So in a sense, what is happening in this field is there is a person who acts as the friend or companion to your soul as you are cultivating deeper receptivity to God or the divine or that which is greater for yourself.
Okay. Friend is a very informal term. It doesn't imply training and structure, but obviously there's training and structure involved in what you're doing.
There is.
So why don't you break down then why that is and why there's some formality to this?
Yeah. So if you are going to find yourself a spiritual director or a spiritual companion, anamkara, to walk with, you want to make sure that they are doing their due diligence. You don't want to just go to anybody that says that they do this. You want to make sure that they have put in some time and done their due diligence for this kind of work. And that encompasses a few things. First of all, that they've gone through a training program. And there's lots of different training programs. Some of them are independent. They're all going to be multi-year. It's not going to be something that you can just get done quickly. Some of them are run through seminary programs. So those ones, of course, are going to have a distinct denominational flavor to them. But in the practice of spiritual direction, the offhandedness and the creating of space for the person that you are working with is going to be really important for everybody, no matter what persuasion, religious or spiritual persuasion, the director has for themselves.
Okay.
So you want someone who's gone through training. The second thing you want to look for is someone who is in spiritual direction for themselves. This can be really, really deep work. And you want to make sure that the person that you're going to prioritizes this in their own life. You wouldn't want to go to someone who doesn't value this and make space for it and time for it in their own life. And along paired with that, and everybody kind of does it differently about how much you do of one or the other, but you also want someone who has a resource of supervision for themselves. Because when you're sitting with someone as a director and someone who has come to you is bringing all of their stuff and all of their junk and all of their issues that they're working through with, you as a human person in the director's seat will be triggered by things from time to time. And you don't want that to be something that the directee has to work through. You want to set that aside and take that to a supervisor for your own growth. And when you take it into a supervisor, you're not talking about the issue that your directee had. You're talking about, well, what did I react to in that moment? What work do I need to do to unpack the stuff that got triggered in that moment with the directee? So you want someone who has had training, you want someone who's doing spiritual direction for themselves, and you want someone who has a solid resource for supervision.
Okay. I think you've already touched on it, but I did want to ask the specific question then. What is the purpose, the primary purpose of spiritual direction for the director, the client, if you will?
Yeah. It depends. It's going to be really different person to person, and people come to direction for all sorts of different reasons. Lots of clergy are in spiritual direction for themselves because there's few places where clergy can go and have that sort of spiritual care that they frequently try to offer their congregants. And you can get real burnt out if you don't have a place to go and process and journey yourself.
Okay.
We also see many, many people who are going through deconstruction because the communal spaces, communal religious spaces are no longer safe. But they also have a desire to continue to grow in their spiritual life. Mm-hmm. And it can be easier to do that when there's only one person sitting in the room with you. And you can, as the directee, when you come into the direction space, you don't have to sit with a director that you don't vibe with. Like, find somebody that you resonate with, that you feel safe with. And then you come into that space and it really is focusing on you for a while. And people who are going through deconstruction, people who have endured spiritual abuse, you really need that care and deep attention for a while in order to feel like you can re-emerge and come back out, rejoin the herd, as it were.
Okay. So that would explain, I guess, why this was off my radar until I went through beginnings of deconstruction, and all of a sudden I start hearing about it because,
yeah.
And it kind of makes sense because I guess that this whole idea is probably frowned upon in a lot of more traditional church circles.
It depends, again. So the tradition of spiritual direction has had lots of support in different denominations and has been completely ignored and unknown in others. So in the Catholic tradition, there is an unbroken history of spiritual directors, probably since the beginning of the era. You can take it all the way back to the Desert Fathers and early monasticism in the first few centuries of the millennium.
Wow.
Where people were going out and found their Abba or their Amma and their father or mother and sat with them. And they were doing some of the same things. These desert Abbas and Ammas were asking deep questions. They were sitting with their directees who were coming to them. And so that's been around for a long time in the Catholic Church. So it's extended to the Anglican Episcopal Church. It's been around in some of these more formal traditional eras because they recognize the need for this very intentional personal relationship between person to person. Whereas I think in some of the more evangelical or charismatic spaces, the idea that you would sit with another person really starts to get under the skin of someone who does not want any mediator between themselves and God. And it can feel scary to say, well, I'm going to go see my spiritual director when all you've ever heard is there is but one mediator between God and man.
That makes sense. And because that's where I grew up in traditional charismatic and evangelical spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good segue actually into my next question, which was, what's a typical session look like? Because you've described a couple elements in what you just said. How does that actually flow then? Yeah. Is it varied from person to person?
It is. It's varied person to person. And part of that is, I want to touch back for a moment about what to look for in a spiritual director and what the qualifications are. There is no specific certificate, a shared license for a spiritual director. And that discussion has happened for decades, as long as, certificates have started to be something really important that people are looking for in these kind of coaching, listening professions. And the reason that they can't settle on whether or not to have one is because as soon as you put a license together where there are very strict standards about how to meet it, then you are immediately unable to meet the needs of an individual who comes to you and doesn't fit that mold. So if a person comes to you and is in a spiritual state that needs something different, and you are bound to the license that you hold, then you can no longer serve the needs of that person.
Sure.
So when a person comes to us, to any spiritual director, first of all, we want to know that it's a good fit. And that goes both ways. Right? So the person coming into direction wants to feel comfortable and safe with their spiritual director, like they can talk to them. And the director wants to also feel comfortable. Now, because the director's gone through training, I mean, it's probably going to be fine, but it should be a mutual resonance. You're not, as a spiritual director, you're not looking out to go create a flock of people that are going to be yours to claim. Like, as the spiritual director, I want to be listening to the movement of this Holy Spirit and the movement of the divine is there resonance between me and this person for this stage of their spiritual journey. So that's job number one, is there resonance? And I do that a couple ways for me personally. Now, this is Bethany talking. This might not be the same for every spiritual director. But in the first session, I ask a couple questions. I want to know why they're coming to spiritual direction, what led them to do so. I want to know what does the shape and arc of their spiritual journey up until now look like? Do they have a religious history? And if so, what does it look like? What kinds of questions are they asking for themselves right now? I also want to know, what do you call God? Because that can facilitate our conversation, and it also can give me a little bit of an insight as to where they are in a given moment. Some people, because of what they've experienced, have a really hard time referring to God as Father because maybe they didn't have a healthy or safe father figure in their life. Well, we're not going to use the word father to help create and nurture the relationship to the divine. Now, maybe at some point they'll find a way to connect to that word, but when we're coming into the space together, we're not going to start there. And then I share my story and pieces of it and what resonates with me. And so in that first session,
So there's
it's us. Is there connection between us? Is there resonance? After that, all the other sessions after that are going to look different. They'll come in, we'll do a quick check-in, what's been happening since last we spoke. And then we're going to start with some centering prayer or a centering practice. So much of our lives are loud and noisy and busy, and we have lost the skill of sitting in quiet and of sitting still and pausing and waiting in silence. And some people have different thresholds for their comfort on this. Some people coming in, especially if people are struggling with ADHD, our centering prayer time is going to be short, and that's okay. And it might feel long to them, but our goal is not to just make people miserable and sit in silence to fill some spiritual quota. It's whatever we need to do to just wait a little bit longer, just a little bit longer, to help that center calm a little bit, to come in, to recognize, oh, what am I feeling right now in this moment? Where is there energy in my body in this moment? And can I get that to just breathe a little bit so that we can enter into a space that's reflective and paying attention to what's really going on inside. And after that, the silence time, sometimes I'll start with a prayer or a poem, and we'll use that as a centering practice. After that, the directee is in the chair. They are in the driver's seat. If they want to sit in silence for the entirety of their appointment, they can. If they want to launch into the thing that they've been thinking about, they can. If they want to start asking some questions, they can. And every appointment that I have ever had with every directee has all been different. No two of them are the same. And this, for me, is what I think is the real magic of spiritual direction, is that it's a pause in wherever you happen to be, and we're just looking and seeing what is.
It's almost like you're providing a space and a moment.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Back to that purpose question that you asked before, we're creating a container.
Okay.
I am holding some boundaries outside so that this person can come to rest for a moment, maybe not for very long, but just for our time together, where they can set some things down and just look and be. I have this image in my head when I sit down with somebody. Have you ever walked a labyrinth?
I know what you mean.
Okay. So I love that practice. When there's one up in Calvert County, you can walk around at Middleham Church. They've got a labyrinth there. And a labyrinth has no, you can't get lost in a labyrinth. There's one path in, one path out. And sometimes you look like you are moving closer to the center, sometimes you're moving farther away. Sometimes you think you're getting closer, but then you have to take a turn and it goes a different direction. When I sit down with a directee, I am imagining that I am walking with them through the labyrinth until we get to the moment of coming to the center. And then I get to release them completely, and it's their center that they are going into.
This
It's
sounds
their moment. Mm-hmm.
this sounds like things that if you learned to be a good friend would be deeply valuable, just to work with and be with another human without force and without, agenda.
Yes, without force and without agenda is so true. And when we're friends with people, these are such good skills. I would highly recommend everyone take a moment to learn how to be a spiritual director, because it's been so good for quieting my own but that happens inside, right? Like someone starts talking and I'm kind of listening to what they're saying, but then I'm also in my head going, well, yeah, but what about this? Well, yeah, but this. Well, yeah, but this. And in the practice, and it is a practice, it doesn't just happen automatically. You have to cultivate it, you have to practice it. But can I quiet the inside so that I can be present and attentive to the other person?
So one of the questions I meant to ask was, what's the difference between a spiritual director and a counselor, or a traditional counselor? And I want to take a stab at answering that based on what I'm hearing already, and you can tell me if I'm approaching it.
Yeah.
First of all, you're not trying to fix something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Second of all, you're definitely providing more of a space than a solution.
Yes.
And so it sounds to me like, I think traditional counseling, there's something that someone wants to fix, and they're coming to the counselor to try and address that thing. And then they're expecting some kind of advice or guidance of some kind towards that. Whereas this sounds much more like leading a person into the presence of the Lord and letting that be sufficient for the moment.
Exactly.
So
And it
what
can be
other things would
really,
you?
yeah, it can be really disorienting for someone who has only ever experienced a counseling appointment or a coaching appointment, or even if they've gone to lots of schooling coming into direction, because you want to know, oh, well, what's the goal? What are we
Mhm.
trying to accomplish? What do I want to get out of the rest of this hour? And that's a different kind of appointment, and you will not be coming to a spiritual director for that. But coming to a spiritual director is a time to pause and look around, and the attention is the it, because there are things that the divine is communicating to you. There are things that yourself is communicating to you, but we often don't pause long enough to hear it.
So next, I'd say, what's the difference between this and, say, a typical church environment, like a
Sure.
Sunday
Oh, I
morning?
wanna I wanna add one more thing about the difference between
Go ahead.
um, counseling and spiritual direction. No spiritual direction should diagnose you unless they are licensed and qualified as a counselor, therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist. Spiritual direction should not be giving you a diagnosis. If they start to sense that there is something that would be better addressed by a therapist or counselor or psychiatrist, they should bring that up to you and say, hey, I think this would be good to follow up on, but that's not me. So
Okay.
I want to make sure that that's out there too. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question that you just asked?
Difference between spiritual direction and like a church environment,
Oh, yeah.
Sunday morning.
The attention, first and foremost. When you go to a Sunday morning, and a Sunday morning is great. a church gathering is great. A communal religious experience gathering, Shabbat service at shul is great. That is a communal experience and really important to us as people. Spiritual direction is different because it is focused attention. It's one-on-one attention. And even when we do group spiritual direction, like what you participated in over this past year, there were times when it was paused and it was focused on one person's journey. It wasn't here, we are all collecting together and we're talking about our shared experience and we are worshiping God together. When we come into direction space, we are focusing on one person's journey and story.
And so the other kind of one-on-one thing that typically happens in the church world is the confessional. Certainly outside my experience as a Protestant, but I think it's still worth asking, is there any relationship between this and the confessional thing, or is this, because I think in both cases it sounds like you're presenting yourself to the Lord and seeing what the Lord will say, but I think the confessional is more just about spilling your sense of what you got wrong. This doesn't sound like that to me.
Yeah. I mean, truthfully, I'm not a practicing Catholic, so you might have a better answer if you're speaking to someone within that tradition to speak to the full range of what happens in confession. But that's my understanding too, and that's not what we spend time on. I mean, if the divine is bringing up something that needs to be confessed, I will hear it. Absolutely. And we can talk about it and sit with it and seek what the Lord has to say about it. But I'm not going to, prescribe any amount of prayers or sits for people to do in order to absolve a sin. Like that's not what's happening there.
That makes sense. So given all that, what you talked a little bit about how the relationship between the directee, is that the term you use, and the director is based on being able to mesh and fit together well. Are there specific things that different spiritual directors try and bring to the table for themselves? Is there like, I'm this kind of a spiritual director, or is it just purely, I'm a spiritual director, and if we mesh, if we click, then is there something that you particularly bring to the table, you think?
Yeah, it's going to be different person to person, and that's part of the beauty of it, because I mean, every person in the whole entire world is different and unique, and we have different strengths, and our personality comes into play, our story comes into play. All of that ends up having an effect on how we come across to people and how people receive us. Some directees are going to be really, really formal, or some directors, sorry, are going to be really formal, and others are going to be, loud and bombastic, and even in that centering prayer time, it's going to have a little bit more energy in the contemplation time. You're just going to have someone that's different every single time, depending on where the person is. A director who is meeting with someone who has been in spiritual direction for years is going to have a really different experience to someone who's just starting out in spiritual direction. Okay. So for me, I have a couple things. First of all, what I tend to see, and it might be people who are drawn to me. It might be things that I just notice. I notice a lot of shoulding that happens with people. People come into direction space with me and they'll start sharing their life, but then at the end of their stories, they'll tack on, but I really should be doing this. Oh, I know I should be doing this, or I should be having this. Well, we spent some time talking about where that should comes from and what does God require of you? And how does God feel about you? And how do you know that? How do you know what you know about God? Practically speaking, I'm finishing up, or have finished, certification in the narrative Enneagram. and as a practitioner. So I use the Enneagram in one-on-one sessions with people in spiritual direction, or if they want to have specifically time to talk about the Enneagram and have it not be spiritual direction, I do that as well. And the Enneagram, if you're unfamiliar, is a personality tool that goes beyond just, okay, well, this is my personality, but it actually starts to go into, okay, well, now that we know these habits and patterns, let's dig down a little bit deeper to the questions of why those are there and what fear is fueling those. And let's see if we can relax that a little bit so that we can make some other choices going forward. It's, to me, from my own point of view, is by far the most nuanced and flexible and applicable personality typing system that I've come across.
Mm-hmm. It was useful for helping me understand my motivations and my reasons for doing things in a way that the standard other personality things, the ISTJ or whatever, those kinds of, that was good for me, but was not informative, I guess, which was interesting.
Yeah. And in February, I've got a free 4-session intro to the Enneagram that is up on my website, so you can check it out and join if you are interested.
Yeah, I'll drop a link in the chat in the description.
That's great. Yeah, so it'll be 4 sessions. The first session will just be introduction to the system and what it is and how to ethically use it, and what it's not. It's not something, woo-woo, crazy, magic, new agey stuff. It's like there's some really good content in there. And then the following 3 sessions, we'll be looking at 3 personality types each of the following 3 sessions for a total of 9.
I think probably spiritual direction and any kind of personality typing system get a lot of Christians' hackles up because, like, the word magic is, I think, that there's this idea that there's something magical about them that they need to avoid. Yeah.
This one is really interesting because Evagrius in the 3rd century wrote about 8 driving forces within the human soul, and then talked about a 9th that was over all of them, and they happened to map right onto what we have now in this 20th century, 21st century, named the Enneagram and organized. The Enneagram itself is just a graphic organizer for these 9 different ways of being, 9 ways of seeing the world. So this is actually Christian tradition for a really, really long time. And those Evagrius's 8+1 was then revamped by, I forget the person who actually coined the 7 deadly sins, but that person took his 8+1 and kind of mushed them around a little bit into getting what we know as the 7 deadly sins. And hundreds and hundreds of years later, now we have a whole bunch of people who have heard of them, but have no idea how they operate in their own lives.
So I think I know the answer, but I think you'd probably agree with me that there's no need to be Christian or even religious to benefit from spiritual direction.
It's true. Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, spirituality is this receptivity to that which is greater than yourself. And I think all of us as humans recognize that we are not the most powerful thing in the world. Sometimes that's really scary. Some of us really, really hate that. But actually, if you can embrace the fear behind that, if you can embrace the anger behind that, there's some really beautiful work that you can do. And there's some really wonderful growth relationally that you can do that benefits your life and your relationships with other people. So you can do that work in spiritual direction, whether or not you have a very formalized theology framework that you work with.
Okay. What are some of the pitfalls for spiritual directees or, for the whole process? Are there ways you can get yourself into trouble, or they can get into trouble, or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of them will always be outsourcing your spiritual development to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are going into spiritual direction thinking that your director hangs the moon and everything that they say is absolute truth, that's not serving either one of you very well. And I think there's some really elegant solutions that that directors have found over the years. Typically, direction appointments are once a month. And that's a really long time. It doesn't seem like a long time, but a lot can happen in a month. When you are doing therapy, especially if you're in a rough time and you're doing therapy, you are seeing your therapist every other week, maybe even every week, depending on how things are going. And you are regularly checking in with them to keep that momentum going. But because the purpose, if I want to call it purpose, in spiritual direction is so different, where it's not about let's achieve a goal and let's get somewhere together, but it's about pausing and seeing where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Once a month is great because it's not going to let you make an idol of your spiritual director if you are continuing to cultivate a spiritual life on your own.
Do you prefer to avoid working with friends?
Yeah. Yes.
So you're avoiding the pitfalls of knowing too much and.
Yep. And I have to acknowledge that my perspectives are not true all the time. They are flawed. And to come into a direction relationship with somebody that is my friend or my family member, especially, I am more likely to get things wrong with them because I've got my own relationship with them hung up in that.
And you've got a knowledge history which may not serve seeing something
Right.
deep.
Right. And, again, things change. There are sometimes it becomes really clear that you and a person that you are friends with that is a spiritual director, that the divine is moving the two of you toward that relationship. And sometimes that's really clear. And it will be clear to both parties, right? It won't be just like one person thinks that and the other person thinks that. And then, of course, there's all the other normal things to look out for that you would see in any sort of listening profession. Like, you obviously don't want to develop a romantic relationship with your spiritual director. That's not okay. And if that's not, or if that's coming from the other direction, director to directee, that's really not okay. And then you want to make sure that things are confidential,
Mm-hmm.
right? Anything, the only things that should come outside of that confidential area is if there's something that falls under that mandated reporter status. Now, technically, because again, spiritual direction lives in kind of a liminal space, they're not mandated reporters. However, most spiritual directors are going to follow mandated reporter processes and procedures anyway. So if there are things about harming self, harming others, harming minors, they're going to speak up to somebody and they're going to let you know ahead of time that that's what's going to happen.
But I imagine that's less common than in a counseling situation because you're not coming in with a problem to fix so much as coming in with a desire to sit in the presence of the Lord together.
It's true. However, sometimes some of the really painful things that we've experienced in life or are experiencing in life, they come with spiritual baggage.
Mm-hmm.
So if this isn't my case, but if I were coming into spiritual direction and I really, really, really struggled with porn and it happened to like dip over into porn with minors, like, and I shared that with my spiritual director because I am concerned about how God feels about me and it's really affecting my spiritual life. Well, now my spiritual director needs to do some follow-up on that.
Sure. So How do you support someone who's going through a deconstructive process or some crisis of faith, or there's something that goes beyond just I want to get closer to God, and it's almost the opposite? Because I'm sure that would enter your sphere from time to time. What do you do with that?
Wait.
Okay.
A lot of times what people need is to be heard and validation that they're not crazy. Because when they're in these religious spaces and they're trying to bring these things up, they're being told over and over and over that they're crazy, whether it's explicitly told to them or not.
There's gaslighting, there's Darvo going on all the time, and
all the
spiritual
time.
abuse. Yeah.
And so you need someone to believe you. And so a lot of listening. At no, as a director, I am never going to start to help a person rebuild, if you want to say reconstruction, their theological framework without their being led by their spirit, without feeling their heart whole.
Mm-hmm.
The mental processes will absolutely follow and flow once a person's soul is at rest, once their heart has been comforted.
So the first step is sitting in the presence of the divine, and before you even begin to think about putting the bricks back in your foundation.
Yes. And the group that you were a part of, I was trying out 2 different groups this time. And the group that you were a part of was more of a spiritual formation group. So we were examining a lot of ideas. Mm-hmm. We were exploring lots of ideas. We were reading lots of content. We were doing a lot more challenging questions like, well, what if we thought this and this person has this to say? And I would not do that with people who are coming into direction for the first time, especially if they're going through deconstruction. The other group that I was working with was mainly direction. And we had a short time to talk about a topic each time we met, but the majority of the time was doing direction and concentrated listening and attention to one another.
Yeah, and I picked the group that I did because I'd been in the deconstruction space for about 3 years already, and I was at the point where I was pretty confident I understood myself well enough that what I was interested in was learning more about other people and other ideas, and so that fit my needs at that time. I don't think that would have served me very well at the beginning of my tearing bricks apart kind of stage.
No, absolutely not. And if someone is coming in, and they may be coming into spiritual direction really confident in what they believe and what they feel. And I am not interested in, pulling the rug out from under people and like, well, have you considered what these people who are in deconstruction say? Like, that's not what I'm here for at all. I'm here to be supportive and to help allow them to encounter the divine. And if it is the divine's agenda or God's agenda or their own journey and quest and question to start to unpack some other things and to do some of that challenging, go through the wall kind of work, that will be clear to them and they will lead that forward. That is not something that's going to come from a director saying, hey, it's time for you to move out of this stage and into a new stage.
Yeah, and that sounds like a really dangerous thing to tell somebody in any circumstance.
Absolutely.
Because you're presuming then that you would know what's really going on inside them, which
absolutely.
You can't.
Nope.
So how do you stay grounded? Do you have a spiritual director of your own? How do you stay grounded in your own spiritual life? Because this certainly has got to be emotionally invested.
Yes. Yeah. I do have my own spiritual director. We meet once a month. And she's wonderful. I can sit in silence for so long, and I so rarely feel that that's okay. I often feel like I want to make sure that other people are feeling comfortable. And I know silence makes other people uncomfortable lots of times. But when I go to see my spiritual director, I can sit in quiet for a long time. And then I can take as long as I need to find words to bring up what's inside. And then she's really good at listening to me and hearing themes and stringing themes together. My spiritual director is also certified in IFS therapy, internal family systems therapy. And that's been really, really helpful for me. So we use a lot of IFS therapy in my session. Yeah, so that's been really, really great for me.
That would be a good topic for another interview.
Yeah. I do a lot of, for my own practice, I do centering prayer. I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of meditative reading. So I'm not trying to chew through content. I'm trying to read and sit and read and sit and read and journal and sit. And I'm reading for transformation more than information. I love being in nature. That is a huge way that connects me to the divine, to God. And I have found through this, my own journey, my own process, I had my big spiritual awakening in 2005 in Scotland. And my ancestral history is also from Scotland. And so I got curious about Celtic practice. And so I've read a lot and done a lot of trying things out in that space. And that has been really, really beautiful. And I have lots of things to say about that as well. But so those are some of the practices that I do for my own life.
One of the things I'm learning in the last few years is this just generalized sense that I don't think it's quite so important the how of connecting with the Lord. Mm-hmm. And I'm very much inherited. I've been trying to avoid saying that I was taught, because I don't think anyone explicitly taught me many of these things, but the practices and the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy that I understood for so long, I think was very much of the nature that there was one right way from everything in one form or another, had a right thing to it. And, as you describe discovering things, overseas and finding a particular type of practice there, doesn't mean that that's any more right than anything else. It doesn't mean that the others are wrong. That this whole thing is about coming and posturing yourself before the Lord, before the divine, what name we want to give it. The contemplative spirituality group that I participate in every other week, one of the phrases that the leader uses is your many names. And he's not using them, and he's not saying that in the sense of that Christian poster that every evangelical who's worth anything has seen of the names of God, and it's it's recognizing that there's a lot of different ways that we name the divine.
Yes.
And that those are all valid and useful in each of their own ways. And so we can kind of lay aside the sense of that's not the way it's okay to be before the Lord, because God said to do it this way in that Bible verse. And so what you're describing, all of this that you're describing is that we're presenting a place, it sounds like, for the Lord to do work in a almost infinite variety of ways without judging or forcing any of it.
Absolutely. And this is getting a little bit into my own theological framework, but my gosh, what would the world be like if that divine spark resident in every single one of us was able to connect authentically to the source and then expressed fully?
Yeah.
And, in some of our religious spaces, we think that means that they would all be expressed the same.
Mm-hmm.
But how could it be when the divine is infinite?
Yeah, my most recent blog post was unity is not uniformity, or vice versa.
Yes.
Yeah, you can't get away from that in a lot of the church situations because we've been taught that there's one right way.
Yeah.
And I think so. Your comment about how amazing it would be, to me, the thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how amazing would it be if we could stop demanding of others that they fit into our pattern so that we would then call them acceptable and see that spark in them.
Yeah.
So it's not that they're not already doing it, because they are. The question is, can I sit in that presence of something that is very odd to me, very different?
Yes, absolutely.
Like last night, the contemplative spirituality group that I meet with basically listens to a song, and then we read something. Can be, Bible verses. It can be something, a poem. Last night it was a secular song, and it was a selection of about 4 different chunks from a secular book titled Bloom. And, every Christian's going to bloom where you're planted was the, but not at all religious, either one of those two things. And yet at the end of those things, as we talked through what we encountered in that process, it was such a rich spiritual discussion. I won't even say religious discussion. It was a spiritual discussion about what the Lord brought to light for each one of us in that moment. And there was so much of value there in coming before the Lord in the presence of something very secular.
Yes.
It was fascinating.
Yes.
And that's something that my upbringing would have thrown out as being heretical, or at the least unhelpful and maybe dangerous.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Pardon me. The are you familiar with Rainn Wilson?
Rainn Wilson, no.
Okay. So he was an actor on The Office, is what he's most famous for.
Okay.
But he's also very passionate about spirituality and soul work. And he's a practicing Baha'i. And he wrote this book called Soul Boom. And
I've heard the title.
Yeah, and he talks to all kinds of people and explores all these different ideas and practices and figures who have and also speaking about his own personal journey and his own life and what it's looked like to go on a spiritual journey for himself. And one of the things that he's arguing in there is how our humanity is ripe for a soul boom, that there is this kind of increase of wanting our souls to come alive. Mm-hmm. And I agree deeply. I think it's very true. We have benefited for a really, really long time in formal religious structures. There's a lot of beautiful things that happen in formal religious structures. But if all you have is the religious structure, where is the life in it?
Yeah, and I think I inherited a sense that the religious structure was the end, not the means.
Right.
I don't think that anyone thought that necessarily, but pragmatically, that's the way it expressed itself. Yeah. If you do these things, then you go to the right place.
Right.
Instead of if you are this, which is a very different approach.
Yeah.
To become something and instead of to do something.
And it makes a lot of sense to me because we spend so much of our time in physical spaces, doing physical things, hearing things, seeing things, moving through space and time. All of that is very based on practice. What do you spend your day doing? When you're doing spiritual work, that's invisible stuff. That is unprovable things. Those are let me go inside here and try to connect with what's going on inside. I mean, there are mystical experiences. I have had some of my own that I know are true, but when I communicate them to other people, I sound crazy. And I don't need them to agree or believe with what I experienced. That's not something that's important to me. But I know the effect they had on me, and I spend time reflecting on that. Well, that's me cultivating my spirituality. And that's really different. That is a different form. And if I hadn't been brought forward by some of those mystical experiences and shown a way forward by some spiritual directors in my life, whether or not they were calling themselves spiritual directors. But if I hadn't been brought forward, I would still be thinking that the religious form and structure and framework was it, because that's what I spend most of my day doing.
And I think the more tightly we find ourselves tied to an institution, a religious institution, the more that's the true.
Yes.
I mean, it's been very disconcerting, but stepping away from religious institution for a season freed me up greatly to perceive a lot of things that were invisible to me before, because the praxis, the process, all the busyness stole my attention from the being.
Yes. And that's what spiritual direction wants to return to you.
Yeah, one of the phrases that just keeps popping up on my radar these days is the ground of all being, you know?
Yes.
It's something I never encountered until the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So that grounding, I think.
Tell me about that for you. About the ground of all being. Tell me about that for you.
It went from being what I did for the Lord to understanding that, and this is a concept that floats around in evangelicalism, but only, but doesn't really land anywhere, is this idea that you are simply because, you know, and that we are acceptable to the Lord, period. And that every human is, and that we say that, but I don't think we ever really believe it for most people, because it's always tied to, have I done enough? Have I believed enough? And so that sense of finding acceptance at a very, very deep level for the first time in my life that wasn't tied to what I was doing, what I was saying, who I was ministering to, who I was witnessing to, you know, did I think the right things? Did I behave the right way? Did I not behave the wrong way? And so that groundedness of just existing as a human that the Lord created has freed me from so much of the mess that goes along with all those other things, that it allowed me to begin to perceive the Lord and perceive my relationship with the Lord in a much richer way, even though it was simpler. That's
what helped you to connect to that? What helped you to connect to that?
Probably stepping away from the busyness was the first thing. And then discovering that, I mean, I'd always known I was a performance-oriented person, that I was functionally very driven by what other people thought of me. And so in discovering that so many of the things that I did, I hadn't realized brought me an emotional value, a dopamine hit, whatever, for being recognized for doing and being by other people around me. And so, in some sense, being forced to set that aside by the circumstances that I went through, having that ripped away gave those other things a chance to bloom, to blossom a little bit in ways that hadn't been able to before, because I was never slowed down enough So I think that was a big part of it. And then secondarily, in the process of deconstructing a lot of the theology that I'd held for so long and beginning to read people like Richard Rohr that just completely upends your sense of what God really is. Brian Zand, George MacDonald, people that just connect with the Lord in a completely different way, and discovering that maybe it wasn't as stovepiped and isolated as I'd been assuming it was for so long. And some of these things that were in me and in my heart and in my spirit all along that I'd tried to convince myself were not enough, or not correct, or not built, in the proper fashion to get me to heaven. When you strip all of that stuff away, it opens your ability to connect with God in a way that was impossible to you before. And so that groundedness, I think, comes from that none of that stuff is as important as it turns out. And so you can just exist in the presence of the Lord all the time. And I think it gave me an appreciation for Paul's, pray without ceasing, right?
Yeah.
I think it was Paul. And, to a good evangelical, that means, well, I have to be, doing this all the time and saying, Lord, no. There's this sense of prayer, of just staying connected, that is so much different than, and when I give myself permission to not fit someone else's definition again of how that's supposed to look. And so this thing of spiritual direction being so multifaceted and untied to a particular practice is, I think, touches in that very neatly.
I love what you said about once you started to tap into this, it allowed things that were already inside of you to rise to the surface and to connect to the divine. And you didn't feel like you had to stuff it back down or stuff it away. And oh my gosh, that feels like such a huge win when I hear you say it.
And you've watched me walk through this process for almost 5 years now. So, none of this is news to you. So it's interesting to hear that.
I don't get bored hearing the same explanation, because it's never the same, right? When I'm meeting with the directee, like, especially if it's somebody that I've met with a long time, I know their story, like I've heard their stuff, but it's never the same. It's always different. We're always exploring something new. They're finding different ways to communicate it. They're finding different ways that it affected them. It's such a beautiful practice. And it changes me too. I come away from direction sessions inspired and informed for my own spiritual practice.
Yeah. And I never said what I just said in that form in any circumstance. So even in the process of coming to a spiritual direction session or just a healthy conversation between two friends, there's an opportunity for some new things to be blossomed in that discussion. So
absolutely.
So I want to ask you where people can find. Well, let's ask this first. Where do you envision your spiritual direction practice that you're trying to do as a formal thing? Where do you see that coming or growing or changing in coming years?
Well, I would love to do this every day, all day. I would love spiritual direction to be my full time. Right now, I am during my day job is a music educator, public music educator. I work with elementary school choirs and general music and strings. And then I do spiritual direction in the evenings and weekends. And I work with independent people who just want spiritual direction for themselves. And I'm also work with seminaries who want spiritual directors for their seminarians to have support as they are going through the seminary process. So eventually, I would love to be able to fill my days with doing this kind of work. I also have, big grand dreams about designing a retreat center to help people cultivate a more balanced rhythm of retreat and entry. The vision that I have in my mind is not some secluded retreat where you just escape from things, but a dynamic one where you can feel the rhythm of exhale, emptiness of breath, inhale, fullness of breath, and that there is connection with the community and vibrancy close to the community. And then on this, in this space, whatever it looks like, then there's also opportunity to retreat and go quiet and let stillness be the order of the day. So I have big dreams about how to make that happen too. But the most important thing to me is that I'm just getting to work with people one-on-one and walking them through their labyrinth until they get to the center and letting them have that moment.
So if someone's listening to this and think, I'd love to talk to Bethany about this, do you have space in your schedule for that?
I do.
And
yes.
Where can people find you?
They can find
I can certainly put a link, you don't have to spell it. So
absolutely. So my website is cottageanam.com, and I'm going to spell it for you because not too many of us in America here speak Gaelic, but is CARAIDANAM.com.
Yep, and I'll put a link.
Yeah. Yep. So you can find me there, and you can request an appointment, and it'll send me an email, and then I'll reach out to you, and we'll schedule something that works for both of us.
Are you on any of the socials?
I am. You can find me on Facebook and on Blue Sky and on Instagram and TikTok for like the next, 5 days. So I don't know. Yeah. We'll see what happens with that.
All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun, as it always is. And we'll find another topic to talk about sometime soon, because it's just always enlightening to me and encouraging. So
sounds great. I love it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there you have it. You've probably noticed that, true to form, Bethany couldn't miss the chance to ask me a gentle and inviting, yet deeply probing question. And really, I was surprised by what came up in me as I thought about it and answered her. And I think that's really a perfect example of what happens in a spiritual direction session. She was inviting me to open up to the divine and to explore something about my spirituality that I had not considered before. And there was no wrong answer, just a chance for me to connect a bit more deeply with God and our time together. If you'd like to learn more, it's worth visiting her website. I'll drop the links in the show description for you. So that's it for today. Thanks as always for spending some time with me, and I hope you'll stop back in again soon. Be blessed.